Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diaconu Maxim, and I'm professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration from Alexandru Ioan University of Iași, Romania. Today, I'm going to present you the paper entitled Empirical Investigation of the Nexus Education Spending Economic Growth, written with two of my colleagues, Professor Popescu and Associate Professor Petrișor. So, the public spending accounts for a large share of the financing of education in most countries. The idea that the size of the public sector is positively related to the level of economic development is not new. Wagner's law of increasing state activity, for instance, points to an apparent empirical regularity, hereby an increasing share of overall government expenditure in the national economy is associated with rising income per capita. He attributed expansion of the public sector to continued cultural and economic progress, which has associated social welfare, regulatory and infrastructural requirements that necessitate a growing role for government spending in the economy. Baumol-caused disease hypothesis also predicts a growing public sector as a proportion of the economy. This is attributed to higher labor intensity and lower productivity growth in the public sector than in the private sector. Technological advancement, innovation, and substitution of capital for labor lead to increases in wages in the private sector, which are mirrored as cost increases in the public sector. Under this explanation, public sector expansion is largely cost-driven. Considering all these aspects, the purpose of the present paper is to empirically investigate where there is a direct relationship between public spending on education and the economic growth of the countries. By investigating the specialized literature, we found that the ability of publicly provided education to reach all parts of society makes education a useful conduit through which social, cultural, and economic progress can be advanced. Public financing of education is therefore expected to expand along with overall public spending as part of government's effort to promote economic growth and development, especially if education is viewed as a merit good and a productive component of public spending. To measure economic development, income per capita has widely been used as an explanatory variable in studies of education spending. The intuition is that richer, more developed countries have greater resources with which to fund various social programs such as education. The evidence suggests a positive relationship between the national effort to measure and economic development. Evidence concerning the budget's share is more limited. The few studies employing this measure mostly report a positive association between budget share and economic development, although the relationship is not always significant. However, it is reasonable to suppose that, as countries grow and develop, the size and complexity of their respective public sector will grow, so education could end up constituting a reducing share of the total budget allocation under the ceteris paribus hypothesis. A negative association between the budget share and the level of development would be likely if education is a necessity with respect to total government spending. The type of the political regime is also relevant in the analysis of education spending. Regardless of the outcome measure, national effort or budget share, democratic countries are expected to spend more on education under ceteris paribus. It is well documented in the political economy literature that democracy is positively associated with the public provision of basic services such as education, although there are different views about the exact mechanism underpinning this association. On one hand, the spending more on socially productive public goods such as education provides a politically popular way for governments to demonstrate accountability and broaden their voter pool. On the other hand, evidence also exists for democratic developing countries that poorer electorates prefer government to allocate spending to areas other than education. Hence, a negative association between democracy and education spending could be possible. In order to achieve our purpose, we use annual panel data from 2000 to 2019, before pandemics, for up to 153 countries. Two different continuous outcome measures for public education spending are examined, namely the national effort, total public spending on education as a proportion of GDP, and budget share, total public spending on education as a proportion of total government spending. The level of economic development is represented by a set of dummy variables categorizing countries into 5 groups adapted from the World Bank country list. The sample contains representation across the full range of income levels. The richest group consists of 21st wealthiest long-standing Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, core countries. These countries are the same as analyzed in other studies. The other 4 groups are high income, mostly non-OECD, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income countries. In terms of results, the most important finding is a reversal in the pattern of mean differences for the levels of the national effort compared to the budget share. Interaction of the economic and political dummies, or regional and political dummies, reveals a pattern of significant negative mean differences compared to the base category for the national effort, but positive mean differences for the budget share. These patterns are similar regardless of whether no controls or 3 controls are used. Whether a country has a democratic political system is associated with its education spending patterns, with significant mean differences within the same economic or regional group. For example, regardless of the spending measure, national effort or budget share, when we control for economic or regional group, democratic countries tend to spend more on average than their non-democratic counterparts. The effect of including a measure of income inequality, Gini, is explored because within country disparities in income are likely to influence education attainment and hence the political motives behind the finding of education. However, poor data coverage plugs the use of a Gini measure or any other measure of income inequality, limiting the extent to which meaningful inferences can be made. Nonetheless, the general patterns are maintained, albeit with some inconclusive effects. The latter is not surprising given the considerably reduced number of observations available when introducing a Gini measure. The Gini coefficient itself is not statistically significant in the national effort regression, but has a statistically significant positive sign for the budget share measure. We found out that richer, developed countries tend to make a greater national effort with respect to education. Namely, they spend more on average on education as a share of GDP. In contrast, they tend to have lower budget shares, meaning that they spend less on average on education as a share of total government spending relative to poorer, less developed countries. In terms of national effort, richer country governments do not necessarily value education more highly than poorer country governments, but they have greater capacity to generate income from taxes. They can raise more income from taxes because they have larger former private sector's economies. From a budget share perspective, poorer countries tend to spend more on education as a share of total government spending because they generally have smaller public sectors, which means education tends to comprise a larger share of the total public sector budget. However, richer countries are more likely to have large, complex public sectors with a great variety of fiscal components to be financed from tax revenues. For example, a larger role of the state in providing various kinds of welfare support in richer countries could lead to other forms of public spending, such as education being assigned to lower priority. An implication of this reasoning is that publicly provided education as a whole might take on the characteristics of a necessity with respect to public sector spending in richer countries. For a comparable level of economic development, democratic governments tend to spend more on education. On the other hand, our empirical results for the robust estimator with controls show that poor, non-democratic countries have low budget shares that are not necessarily much different from those of richer democratic countries. This suggests that the former not only have smaller public sectors, but also have lower allocations to education from the public purpose. This might partially explain why such countries remain poor and less developed. Our results underline several interesting conclusions. First of all, we may say that richer countries tend to spend, on average, a larger share of GDP on education, but a smaller share of total government spending on education. Meanwhile, poorer countries tend to spend, on average, a smaller share of GDP on education, but a larger share of total government spending on education. Richer countries, on average, make a greater national educational effort, whereas poorer countries allocate a greater budget share to education. By implication, richer countries, on average, have a larger public sector than poorer countries. In addition, for comparable levels of income, democratic countries tend to spend more on education than it is the case of their non-democratic counterparts. Thank you very much for your attention.